Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom. Welcome to my podcast, where we will go deep into the lair of the purple worm instead of down into the rabbit hole, where we'll voyage into the astral realm of my mind and explore the verse of nerd culture. This is Phantom Thoughts. Hey folks, on this episode, I'm going to talk briefly about a game that I've acquired, that I find some interesting parts about it. I'm also going to respond to some calls, and then at the end, I'm going to respond. The last call responses are going to be about OSR October. I have sort of a little ramble that I go through at the end there, just kind of discussing my thoughts on it. If you don't have much interest in OSR October, or just it gets too much for you, that is the last thing. So you can shut it off then. That's why I put it on the end. But a little rambly, a little meandering, but some points that I thought were worth making. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a game called Grok. And yes, there's nothing wrong with me. I said it that way because it's spelled Grok ? So a little funny sounding, but an interesting game nonetheless. Just reading briefly from the features of the game on the inside cover. An FKR OSR inspired rulings over rules design, challenge oriented and adventure focused gameplay, adaptability to any setting, universal slot based resource management system, player facing dice pool resolution, description based action modifiers, and player directed fail forward mechanics. The base setting that they provide in Grok, which they don't give you a lot of details, they do give you some details and a lot of tables so that you can create your own setting. It's more of a gonzo type setting. And the art, normally I'm not an art guy, but the art is very evocative. It's a 32-page booklet, including the 2 inside covers. So 34, I guess, if you count the outside covers. And there is full-page art on 6, I think, of the inside covers, and then some other smaller pieces of art scattered throughout. And it's pretty amazing stuff. I backed it on Kickstarter, so I got the booklet and some character creation guide / character sheets, and a couple of other little pieces of art on cardstock with some dot matrix on the back. And, this is something, the character, I'm going to talk about the character cards here. These little character cards I got. It's very simple. It's got the character creation guide on one side, where you can choose different things, which I'll go over in a minute, or you can roll a die and just have it randomly generated. And then the other side is the actual character sheet, which has a place for character name, the 3 types of attributes: physical, mental, and social; traits, which are things that define your character; resources, which are divided between assets, which are things your character has access to. This includes, if you employ a henchman, you put the henchman as one of your resources. And you can also have what are called conditions on resources, which are sort of a negative that's been applied to your character. And then some notes at the bottom. And then the chart that is used to determine the results of actions that you roll for. One of the reasons I wanted to bring this up was, as I was going through the guide, was looking at the actions that when the character wants to do something, anything. It gives an order of actions. And I wanted to talk about this because over on the Nerds RPG Variety Cast with Jason Connerly, they've been talking. There's been a lot of discussion on several episodes about premature imagination, where a player describes what they're going to do and the outcome, and then they roll a die. And what if the dice roll doesn't match what the player described? What if they described this grand success and they failed? So I found it interesting that under actions, they actually give kind of and as it's described itself, it's kind of a rules light sort of setting, but they sort of give you a general formula for describing your actions. You describe the intention, what do you want to happen, narrate the action, which is where Jason was talking about a lot of times things would go wrong. What is your character doing to make it happen? So, specifying what you want to do, but not necessarily specifying the outcome. And then the third part of that formula is determine the outcome, what happened. And it goes on to say that the action's outcome is immediately obvious. The director, which is the game, what they call the game master in this system, they call the players, actors, and the GM, the director. The director can simply dictate the outcome if it's obvious. Or, using one of the three attributes that most pertains to that action, you roll a die. And the three attributes, you're going to have a die type. It's one of those ascending, descending die type systems where you can have a D4, D6, D8, D10, D12 for an attribute that you roll. And then through gameplay, you can raise it or it can be lowered if you suffer some sort of setback. And then there's a simple little chart. It applies to everything. It's a universal type chart. If you roll 1 to 4, the outcome is not what you intended. If you roll a 5 to 9, it is what you intended. And if you roll a 10 plus, it's what you intended. Plus, there's a fortunate happenstance. And of course, if you roll that no, then usually there's something negative that happens. And those cases are usually called conditions. And what conditions are is they can affect one of your assets. So you break your sword, your bow runs out of arrows, your henchman is injured, your magic item runs out of charges, something along that line. Or they can be applied directly to your character, in which case they take up a resource slot. And that's where this gets interesting, because you start off with, I believe it's 7 resource slots. And at the beginning, when you're creating your character, you're going to acquire 4 assets. So 4 of those slots are going to be filled. And as time goes on, you will have more asset slots. You will acquire more assets and fill those slots. But if you fill them too much, you don't have room for any conditions. So what happens then? Well, then those conditions go down as traits. Traits are part of the character. Initially, you will start off with 5. 1 for personality, 1 for motivation, 1 for background, 1 for a trouble, something that bothers you, so something negative, and 1 for appearance. And these are all considered under the vast cloud assets and conditions and traits as what's called aspects in the game. And it's just a word or a phrase that describes something about your character and how it interacts with the world. These are important because every time you're trying to perform an action, if you have an asset, if you have an aspect that applies, whether it's an asset or a trait, or maybe even a condition, that can give you an advantage or disadvantage. In this system, you can have up to 5 advantages. You can have up to 5 disadvantages. They do counter each other. And for every advantage and disadvantage, whichever attribute you roll a die for, you roll a die. If you've stacked up a bunch of advantages, you'll take the highest of those dice. If you've stacked up a bunch of disadvantages, you will take the lowest of those dice. So traits are important, resources are important, and conditions, which will be something negative that applies to you when you fail an action, or maybe as a result of not taking an action. Those can provide a disadvantage. And what's more, when you get a condition applied as a trait, whatever attribute that condition applies to, you are incapacitated. You cannot perform actions using that attribute until you clear up that condition. If more conditions are applied to that same attribute, then that attribute begins to drop dice. So if you had a D8 in your physical attribute, you have a condition applied, you are now incapacitated with that attribute. You get another condition applied to your physical condition, it drops from a D8 to a D6. And if you get down to where you would drop below a D4, you are considered, in the words of the game, functionally or literally dead. The character is considered functionally or literally dead. Not you, the character. So your resources and your traits and your attributes, they're all linked in this system. If you don't have enough room under your resources, conditions will start being applied as traits. If you start having conditions applied as traits, that affects your attributes, and that can end things for your character. So it's a pretty interesting system. There's a few other things to it, and there's a lot I didn't cover in terms of, some of the resources they give to the director to help build their own world. And again, there's some good charts in here, but it's a nifty little game. The art is amazing. And like I said, I'm not an art guy. I'm not a guy that says, "Oh, look at the art of that game." But this stuff, this is some wild, weird stuff, as they say. It's worth looking at. It's worth picking up, I think, for a lot of folks. If any of what I just said sounds interesting, Grok can be picked up on itch at lesstortoise.itch.io, and I will put that in the show notes. Also, on DriveThruRPG, you can get digital or a physical copy of the game. Just look for Lester Burton or put in GROK ? I don't think there's anything else that's going to have that combination in there. So that's it. Just going over a little game I picked up that I thought the mechanics were interesting, and I thought the fact that they gave kind of a little formula for how to state your actions was interesting in considering some of the discussion that's been going on over on the Nerds Variety RPG cast. And now we're going to get to the calls. We're going to hear from Kevin from the Redcaps Podcast about guns. We're going to hear from Joe from Hindsightless just about my podcast in general. We finally were able to connect and get him a link where he was able to finally subscribe to the podcast. And then at the end, as promised, I'm going to hear from Rob from the Down in the Heap podcast and Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety cast about OSR October.
Good day, sir. It's Kevin calling in from the Redcaps Podcast. Just finished listening to your episode on guns. I largely agree. I struggle with the idea of having firearms or gunpowder in my games. The one area where I'm pretty okay with it is in naval items where you've got cannons on a boat. But as soon as it becomes handheld, it becomes really tricky. I feel like there needs to be a very large risk-reward side of it where there's potential for really bad effects to happen if the firearm doesn't operate properly, and there needs to be long reload times. And I worry that putting on such restrictions just makes it not fun or even usable, so why bother even having it in the game? So I don't know. I really struggle with the idea of having firearms in most of my fantasy settings, and I've yet to come across a really great system for it.
Yeah, Kevin, with guns, I think after, giving it some more thought, I think where it might work best, guns might work best would be in some sort of a world or a game where it's a lower magic type of world where really powerful magic, it takes time through rituals and stuff to bring it together, so it's not something you could just have in the middle of a fight, where the spells you have lean more towards Vancian magic, where you pop them off, but then you need time to essentially recover them, whatever the system is for recovery. In old school D&D, it was memorization, but it could be something else. In a lower magic world, but it could be a world where maybe alchemy has a stronger presence than it does in a lot of D&D style worlds. Although I know there are alchemist characters in 3.5 and later editions, but overall, it would be something where the characters, could use time beforehand during downtime in an adventure or downtime before an adventure to prepare different concoctions and things that they could use. And the obvious one would be something similar to a black powder style weapon. And in that situation where, your firepower is going to come from guns and not so much from being able to cast Fireball or Ice Storm, then in that situation, guns would probably make a lot more sense. And so you could maybe do away with some of those negatives. You would still want to have them in there to give flavor, the kind of black powder flavor to it, I believe, because black powder is not all that stable. And in a fantasy world where it's not quite our black powder, it probably might be even more unstable. But you want make it a little safer and a little less time consuming to reload, or in the cases, as Joe from Hindsightless has pointed out, when you talked about guns in Pathfinder, expensive, essentially a gold piece per shot. And you could kind of reduce some of that to give the characters the firepower they'd be missing from not having super powerful spellcasters, because it takes time for them to cast powerful magic, or maybe they can throw off one powerful spell and then they're just in there with swords and guns like everybody else. But that way you'd have, the idea of more pulp adventurous type adventures where maybe characters are in a lost land and they're fighting off dragons or dinosaurs with hand cannons and black powder and flintlock weapons, and where they're fighting off dinosaurs or even something along the lines of drakes or dragons with black powder weapons, maybe small cannons. Something like a Lost World, where you have a mix of creatures from the past, like they always like to stick dinosaurs in movies where there's a lost world, or saber-toothed tigers, or woolly mammoths, very angry woolly mammoths. I guess they would have to be very angry if they're going to come after you. Well, not very angry, just maybe a little miffed. Or that you could have fantasy creatures like basilisks and dragons and drakes and things like that. And so then having weapons with a lot of stopping power to them would make a little more sense.
Thanks to all the gods above and below, but everything finally aligned properly. The stars are in the right positions in the heavens. I was able to find and favorite your podcast on Anchor for as long as that's going to last, but it's lasted now, and that's the important part. Thank you for your help, dude. I really appreciate that. I'm super excited I was finally able to follow and subscribe to your podcast, and I'm diving into the latest episode right now, which maybe I should start at the beginning, but whatever. Anyway, man, I can't wait to dive in some more and check it out, dude. So have a good night. Thanks again for your help. Peace out. Okay, I'm done with all your catalog now, and man, you're awesome at this. I just want to say you are a fantastic podcaster. I loved all the research you did on the first story, or that one possible anchor substitute. That deep dive was amazing, dude. So much really practical, useful information there. I loved your talk on guns. Your critical hit episode was awesome. I love critical hits. Pathfinder gets crazy with critical hits. Depending on your weapon and your abilities and shit, you can be critting on a 15. It's gnarly. Your episode on 3d6 down the line was amazing. Such great research. It's just cool to know, how much it's changed over the years, all through the different editions. So anyway, man, can't wait for the next episode. Peace. Dude, so I had to call in again because I forgot about some stuff. PvP. Yeah, I'm not a fan of it. And mostly because in all my years of gaming, when I was as a kid and for the past 10 years, I've never seen it come out well. So that podcast you mentioned, Dungeons and Debacles, might be interesting, man. I might have to check that out. And the other podcast you mentioned, Primeval, the world building one, I'll remember it when I go to look for it on Spotify, but thank you for that. I love world building. That sounds like an awesome podcast. And then, yeah, that wargaming, that fantasy wargaming thing you're doing sounds just so cool, dude. Like, this hobby rules because there's so many aspects of it and people are out there doing it. So keep on gaming, dude. Talk to you later. Peace out for sure. This time, peace out.
Joe, I'm glad we were able to get everything worked out so you could listen. I know you're as a listener, you're very involved and very much provide feedback, which is very good. I know that's very encouraging for folks. And for anyone else out there listening that wants to find my podcast on something other than Anchor, it is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, and Overcast, and Castbox. So if you subscribe on any of those podcasts on any of those platforms, you should be able to find it there. If not, let me know, hit me up on Twitter like Joe did at the Pink Phantom, or send me an email at thepinkphantom1@gmail.com. I'll send you a link to pick up the podcast.
Hey there, this is Clerics Ringmail calling in. Old school revival, old school renaissance? I thought it was overpowered stone rock.
Hey Taylor, after doing some more research, I found out that yes, the overpowered stone rock did in fact supplant outlandish scissors rending, but then in turn was supplanted by overbearing scroll research. But then the scissors cut right through the scrolls, and we're right back where we started. So I'm not sure what to think anymore.
Hey, Pink Phantom, it's Rob from down in Heap. Glad to hear you've got a podcast. I've been listening to it and enjoying it. In your latest episode about talking about OSR October and stuff, I think you set up one of the conundrums faced by a lot of people that identify themselves as OSR, and that's this almost catch-22 thing where people will say, well, what is the OSR? And if you define it too closely, then you get accusations of being a gatekeeper or being like too rigid and stuff and not flexible. But if you're flexible and include all these games that are older games that aren't like compatible with some version of old D&D, then it's wishy-washy, right? So that's the conundrum. If you define it really closely, then you, are probably going to have accusations of being a gatekeeper. But if you make it a really broad definition, then you'll have people say, well, if it's the definition is this broad, what's the point? It's a lot like music genres and stuff too. If you don't think Taylor Swift is country and she wins awards at the Country Music Awards, you're probably upset about it, or you might be upset about it if you feel strongly about what is and isn't country music. And why are you having the Country Music Awards if you can't define what country is? So just have the Grammy Awards. So that's the kind of parallels I see. But interesting conversation, and I hope you continue. Thanks. This may be just for your ears, but if you want to play it on your podcast, that's cool. I did do a podcast about this subject a long time ago. It seems almost like a rite of passage with OSR podcasters that at some point you have to do a what is the OSR episode. But I did one back in January of 2020 called Is the OSR Meaningless Only If You Make It So? And there was, I think, a follow-up episode with calls, a lot of them from Joe, from Hindsightless. So, I don't know, you might be interested in hearing what I had on the topic. I haven't even listened to it in ages, so I don't remember what I said, and if I even agree with what I said then. But, anyway, that might elaborate in more than 1 minute conversations or sound bites what I had on my mind. See ya.
Hey, Jason here. Just want to mention your latest episode, I think, brings up a lot of good points. So, can you have an OSR October if you don't know what the OSR is? And is the OSR like pornography? Do you know it when you see it? I think the answer to that is no. It is not like pornography because we can't agree on it when we see it, right? Hence the new SR thing and everything else. And I tend to agree with Joe. At this point, it's been diluted by people slapping OSR on products that aren't what many of us consider OSR, that it really gets to nothing. And so this is going to be a little bit of a longish couple calls, so I apologize in advance, but I do want to try to answer your point. So traditionally, in my understanding, and I could definitely be wrong, I invite other people with better understanding to call in. Traditionally, OSR has been looked at as one of two ways. One is the mindset way. So for that, we go to Matt Finch's OSR Primer, right? that mindset, the OSR mindset. The other way is TSR era D&D or games that are compatible with TSR era D&D and modules. So that would include the retro clones, that would include your Labyrinth Lord, your Sword and Wizardry, OSE, all those myriad of retro clones. It includes Osric, obviously. But there's a good argument that Castles and Crusades, which is not directly compatible, is maybe the first OSR game. Which puts us back to the mindset argument. I think, but the problem with the mindset argument is, while some things I think are pretty clear in the mindset argument, the idea of rulings over rules, other things, like how much of it really needs to be a pathetic aesthetic, how much needs to be gonzo or not gonzo, I think it really varies table to table. And Matt Finch doesn't talk about gonzo, don't get me wrong, he doesn't talk about pathetic aesthetic. But I think those things in the bean counting and the resource tracking are things that a lot of people in the OSR consider an essential part of the OSR. But when we look at how the game was played back in the day, while a lot of people did that, definitely not everybody did that. You can find plenty of people back in the day that'll tell you they didn't track torches. They didn't track that stuff. I don't think anybody's going to say that Tim Shorts is not OSR and the products he makes don't fit in the OSR. But if you listen to Tim's podcast or talk to him, he'll tell you that, yes, in some games they worry about resource management, but a lot of his games, they don't, because it's not the interesting part of the game. And he's far from the only one. And as far as like power levels, I mean, look at Arduin. Look at the stories of, a lot of the early games. They vary greatly. So I think the idea of what play was like back then is an idealized idea of what is back then. So I don't necessarily think that helps us with the OSR definition either. I actually am more comfortable with just an old school definition as opposed to an OSR, because I think old school, and where do we cut old school off, right? Do you cut it off at 85? Do you cut it off at, I would probably arbitrarily use 85. But I guess you could pick any time frame in there for where you want to cut it off. But old school, so to me, if we want to promote these games, and ultimately that's what we want to do, we want to keep the idea of these games alive, I think. Some people might just be more interested in keeping a play style alive and not care about the original games. I like the idea of playing the original games. So to me, the idealized propaganda for that, God, that's a bad word, isn't it? But the idealized promotion for these old games is something like the Dead Game Society. You can still, you talk about dead podcasts, so I'm going to recommend a dead podcast to you that you've probably listened to called the Dead Game Society. I think they stopped around 2019, sadly, but they promoted and talked about older games. I think your spiritual successor would probably be the Vintage RPG podcast with Hambone Stew. I think they're probably your spiritual successor to the Dead Game Society that's current right now. Of course, you also have the Grognard Files. And the Grognard Files, I don't mean to slight them at all. In fact, that's one of the first podcasts I picked up when I got back in the hobby after hiatus. But ultimately, I think maybe it should be Old School October instead of OSR October if we can't agree on OSR, then I think we can agree these older games have a lot of value and are worth playing. So maybe it's a matter of just promoting Old School October with the idea of recommending these older games to me, old schools, games that existed at the time I got in the hobby and earlier, but I guess maybe it should be 70s and 80s. I don't know. What do you think?
So OSR in October. It's a subject that's greatly making the rounds in the Anchorverse, or at least the portion of the Anchorverse that I inhabit. And it's, there have been a lot of questions about why do it. And I asked those questions myself most recently. But I do think there is a point to it. I know I asked a lot of questions in my podcast about OSR October, and that wasn't meant as a criticism of the idea or to dissuade people from doing it. I do think it's a good idea, and I think it's a good idea for the reasons that Jason has said on his podcast and calling into other podcasts about this subject, that the OSR in some circles has gotten a bad reputation, and it's gotten that gatekeeping, grognardy, toxic reputation that it's a bunch of old guys on their couch saying, "Hey, you young kids, get off my lawn." That's not D&D. And certainly there is that aspect in the gaming universe. And because of the nature of the OSR, that it focuses on the good things of old school style of gaming, it does tend to have a larger presence there. But like Jason said, there's good in the OSR. And the OSR was started with, I think, good intentions of enabling people to continue to play the old school rule sets that were no longer in print. The rule sets that people had played for decades and enjoyed and had passion for and wanted the world to continue to exist. And that's why I think the first sets of OSR rules were retro clones of old rule sets to take the things that were clunky and were, disorganized about those rule sets and make them easier to follow. So definitely having a month celebrating old school games is a good idea. And maybe it should just be a matter of taking OSR out of it. Just the wording, the title, those three letters that have so much weight one way or the other, and there are negative things attached to them. Maybe we should go with, I was just thinking, listening to the comments that Rob had left, maybe OSC, Old School Celebration. Celebrating not even necessarily particular rule sets, but styles of play that go back to the beginnings of the hobby and maybe even before, that were originated in the wargaming community and that helped lead to the entire genre of role-playing games. I think that's definitely something worth doing. That's definitely something worth talking about. Celebrating the adventures, celebrating the modules, celebrating specific rules, celebrating the way some things work together, celebrating a style of play among friends, because ultimately that's what this hobby is about, the RPG hobby. Whether you play older rule sets or newer rule sets, or just combine a bunch of rule sets into a mishmash that you and your friends enjoy, is playing games with friends, or if they're not friends, because this is the online world and people play games by post and via VTT with people that maybe they've never really met much other than in a forum or, on Twitter. But with groups of like-minded individuals who enjoy some of the same things in the hobby that you enjoy. So I do think it's something worth doing, and it is something that I will participate in, because I think we are doing it. Enough people have said, "Hey, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to do it this way," that I think it's definitely going to happen. I guess, should we continue to use the term OSR? Because it's loaded. Again, we're trying to rehabilitate the OSR. Are we trying to rehabilitate the style, or are we trying to rehabilitate those three letters? I don't know. So it could be, instead of OSR October, it's Old School Celebration. Just like there's RPG a Day month, because they don't actually mention August in RPG a Day month. It just happens in August every year. It could be Old School Celebration month. Although I will have to admit that in my mind, when I heard Old School OSR October, my brain immediately went to OctOSR. So that would be fun for me. And I would probably use that if we continued to use the OSR moniker in the whole month. But I do think it's a good idea, and I hope that nobody listened to my podcast thinking that I was just down on the idea. I'm not. I date way back, and I do think there is this mindset in some portions of the hobby that people who play older school, older style, they're these, 40s and 50s and 60s year old people who have been living in their mother's basement since 1983, and, they hate, different aspects of the population, and the world has passed them by and they're angry about it. And really, for the vast majority of us, we're not, who have played old school games. We're not that. I don't doubt there are people like that, just like I don't doubt that there are people in their teens and 20-somethings that are cynical people that hate the world and hate people who don't play the way that they play role-playing games. That is the world we live in, and I think there have always been people like that, and I think the internet serves to magnify that, because like-minded individuals find like-minded individuals, and that can be a very good thing, and that can be a very bad thing. But yes, old school October, whatever we end up calling it, however we end up adjudicating it, I like this swirl of ideas that's going on, and we're still over a month out. And I think ultimately it will be a good and tremendous thing, and I'm looking forward to it. And I do think the idea that, maybe there's not a central authority, maybe there's lots of people putting out their own lists of keywords or their own ideas how they're going to do it, or they're going to do it weekly or daily or a couple of times a month, however they feel about it. I think that is very much in the old school way of doing things, because one thing about the older rule sets, the older way of gaming, is that a lot of it was made up on the fly. There were holes that people didn't see because the people making the rules, they played a certain way. And when you play a certain way, you have that mindset. And maybe you don't always think about people who have a different mindset and a different way of seeing things, and maybe don't see the words that you didn't write that fill in the gaps to the rules and the modules and the adventures that you put out into the world. And so the idea that we're just going to say, hey, we have this month and we're going to celebrate an old school style play, and in true old school fashion, do it your way. It's your game. It's your podcast. It's your month. And I think that could even encourage people who maybe don't care as much about the old rule sets, but there's a part of the style that they enjoy that has spawned off from the OSR that they might want to chip in and say, hey, well, this is something that I learned hearing about the OSR, and I took it in this direction. Because if you look at, there's an NSR. If there was not an OSR, would there be an NSR? A new school revolution. If there wasn't an OSR, would there be an NSR? Because the two, I think, are, I think the OSR inspired the NSR. I think the OSR inspired the FKR, Free Kriegspiel Revolution, which is a delve even deeper into the past of gaming than I think a lot of OSR rule sets are. So there's a lot to it. The rules light movement, the whole rules light movement. I'm not saying it didn't exist before the OSR, but maybe it didn't. I mean, the OSR dates back all the way to the dawn of 3rd edition D&D back in 2000. So maybe there wasn't much of a rules light movement, or maybe there was nothing for it to coalesce around. And maybe the OSR helped seed that. So I do think the OSR has had a good effect overall on the hobby. And I do think that celebrating old school ways of doing things and just looking into the past, because the past is not always bad. The past is not always worse. There's a notion in this world in general, not just in RPGs, that if it's old, the newer is better. And sometimes the newer is not. I mean, I'm old enough to have lived in the 80s and remember the whole New Coke debacle. So, hey, you got that going for you. Although maybe that's not the best example, because I don't think the New Coke debacle was ever about that the flavor had changed and it was worse, but just that it had changed, period. Which that's a good example of a toxic aspect of a fandom. You did what? You can't change that. But I'm getting off the point. The point is OSR October, or whatever you want to call it, I think it's a good idea. And I don't think that it's a shot at RPG a day, and I don't think it's a shot at other styles of play. I've always believed online communities where a group of people who are like-minded about something positive, something good, something that's for enjoyment or for building a community or for getting to know people is good. When online communities start delving into what we don't like and what we hate and what we're against, that's when things start going sideways. And the OSR, I think, started about, hey, this new rule set came out. We don't care much for it. And we want the way that we play to continue to be supported by somebody. And since Wizards of the Coast isn't going to do it, we will. And in a way, Wizards of the Coast did, because without the Open Gaming License, the OGL, there wouldn't be an OSR, at least not specific rule sets that couldn't end up harkening back to the days of TSR where they tried to litigate all their competition out of existence. You want to talk about an old school toxicity, there's your old school toxicity right there. But again, I'm getting off the subject. There is something to many aspects of the old school style play. And no doubt there are aspects of old school styles of play that should rightfully be left in the past. The parts that are exclusionary, the parts that are demeaning, intentionally demeaning to groups of people, those things should be gone forever. Old school, new school, future school, whatever. Don't do it. So let's have a good positive month in October, whether you do it daily, weekly, once, or are just a consumer of celebrating old school games. And I'm going to stop rambling now. I'd like to thank everybody that called in to this show. Kevin from the Redcaps Podcast, Joe from the Hindsightless Podcast, Taylor from Clerics Ringmail Podcast, Rob from the Down in a Heap Podcast, and Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Thanks, guys. It really helps make the show. The music in this episode was Strength of the Titans and Late Night Radio by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. CreativeCommons.org/licenses/by/4.0.